parents said I wasn't smart enough for college. "You'll just waste our money," they said. I quietly moved out and paid my own tuition. Years later they were speechless when it started with a whisper, almost a rumor that passed through the walls of our cramped living room. "He'll just waste our money," my father muttered one evening, not realizing I was in earshot. My mother nodded, sipping her coffee with a smug little smile. "He's just not cut out for college. He's barely making it through high school. What's he going to do in a place like that?" My stomach nodded, the taste of bitterness pooling in my mouth. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe they were having a bad day. Maybe the bills were piling up, and the stress was making them lash out. But as days turned into weeks, their comments became sharper, more pointed. "You think you're going to be some big shot? College isn't for people like us. You'll be back here in no time, begging for a job." That was the night I decided. Quietly, without any dramatics, I packed a bag with my essentials, some clothes, a few books, my worn-out laptop. I waited until they went to bed, their laughter fading into snores, before I slipped out into the crisp night air. My heart raced as I closed the door behind me, a mix of fear and adrenaline coursing through my veins. I found a cheap, run-down apartment a few miles from my parents' house. It smelled of mildew, the paint was peeling from the walls, and the heater rattled like a dying animal. But it was mine. I got a job at a 24-hour diner, working the graveyard shift while sneaking in study sessions during my breaks. The tips were terrible, and I was constantly on the verge of falling asleep at the counter, but I made it work. Every time I thought about giving up, I remembered my parents' voices echoing in my head, telling me I wasn't smart enough, wasn't strong enough. That fueled me. That made me study harder, work longer hours, and push myself further than I ever thought possible. And as I looked around that first night in my tiny apartment, my eyes stinging from exhaustion, I promised myself one thing: I would prove them wrong. Not for them, but for me. The days blurred together into an endless cycle of work, study, and sleep. Some nights, I'd wake up to the sound of the heater sputtering or the wind howling through the cracked window panes. The cold would seep into my bones, but I didn't complain. Every shift at the diner was a battle against exhaustion, a test of how far I could push myself without breaking. I kept my textbooks hidden behind the counter, studying in stolen moments while waiting for the night's last customer to finish their coffee. My coworkers gave me odd looks at first, but eventually they stopped questioning it. They thought I was just some kid trying to make ends meet. No one suspected I was fighting tooth and nail to put myself through school. I remember one morning, after a particularly grueling shift, I sat down at my tiny kitchen table and stared at the tuition invoice on my laptop screen. It was more than I'd ever imagined. For a moment, I considered giving up, calling my parents, swallowing my pride, and begging for help. But then I pictured my father's smug expression, my mother's condescending laugh, and I felt my resolve harden. I took on more hours at the diner. Picked up a second job delivering newspapers before dawn. Ate instant noodles and drank tap water for weeks. Anything to scrape together enough to cover tuition. I barely saw the sun, living in a constant haze of fatigue. But I kept going. The worst part was pretending everything was fine. My parents didn't even call to check on me. It was as if I'd vanished from their lives entirely. But I knew better. They thought I'd come crawling back, defeated. They were waiting for me to admit they were right. I was determined to make sure they were wrong. Months passed, and the weight of my secret life grew heavier. I learned to hide the dark circles under my eyes with cheap concealer, and fake a smile when classmates asked how I was doing. I couldn't let anyone see how close I was to breaking. But somewhere in that grind, something changed. My grades improved. I started understanding the complex theories that had once seemed impossible. Late nights at the diner turned into early mornings in the library. My professors took notice, praising my dedication, my insight. Slowly, I climbed to the top of the class. One evening, after I submitted a paper I was sure would earn me a failing grade, my professor called me into his office. I sat there, nerves crackling like static, waiting for the blow. But instead, he handed me the paper, now covered in red ink, and said quietly, "This is brilliant work. Have you ever thought about applying for a scholarship? A scholarship? The word felt like a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. I applied for every one I could find. Spent sleepless nights writing essays, gathering recommendations, filling out forms. And then one morning, I opened my email to find a message that made me drop my phone onto the floor. I had been awarded a full scholarship. Tuition, books, even a modest living stipend. I sat there, in my cramped apartment, staring at the screen while my hands trembled. The weight I had been carrying for so long, every dollar scraped together, every sleepless night, lifted off me like a heavy coat. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was winning. That scholarship changed everything. It didn't mean I could quit my jobs, far from it, but it gave me breathing room. Suddenly, I wasn't living on instant noodles and tap water. I could afford real groceries, even the occasional takeout splurge. More importantly, I could finally cut back my hours and focus on my studies. With the extra time, I threw myself into academics like a man possessed. I wasn't just determined to graduate. I was determined to graduate at the top of my class. Every sleepless night, every shift at the diner, every moment of doubt, I was going to make it all worth it. And yet, through it all, my parents never called. Not once. No. How are you? No. Do you need anything? They had written me off, convinced I'd fail. I remember walking past a mirror one evening and barely recognizing the person staring back at me. My face was thinner, my posture straighter, my eyes sharper. I wasn't the uncertain teenager who'd slunk away from home in the middle of the night. I was becoming someone else, someone stronger, smarter, more determined than they could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I was capable, that I was worthy, that I could build a life on my own terms. I promised myself I wouldn't go back until I had something undeniable to show them. Something they couldn't dismiss, couldn't ignore. The years blurred into a determined march forward. With every course I aced, every award I earned, I built a fortress of quiet pride. By the time I reached my senior year, I was at the top of my class, the recipient of multiple scholarships, and the subject of whispered admiration among my peers. Professors invited me to conferences, classmates turned to me for guidance. I was no longer the invisible kid who'd slipped out of his parents' house in the dead of night. I was becoming something I never thought possible, someone who mattered. I had carved out a life for myself. It was far from easy, balancing 2 part-time jobs, volunteering for academic projects, and mentoring younger students, but it was mine. The first time I stepped onto the stage to accept an award, my hands trembled. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of that moment. It wasn't just a certificate or a scholarship. It was proof that I'd been right to believe in myself, even when no one else did. As graduation approached, I found myself standing in the bookstore, ordering my cap and gown. The clerk asked, "Name?" And when I gave it, she looked up and smiled. "You're the honors graduate. Congratulations." That moment hit me harder than I expected. I nodded, trying to keep my composure, but my throat tightened. I thought of my parents, of the empty chair at every school event, every parent-teacher meeting. I imagined my father's dismissive snort, my mother's indifferent shrug. And for the first time, I wasn't just angry, I was free. Graduation day arrived in a flurry of caps, gowns, and the clamor of proud families. As I sat in my assigned seat, waiting for my name to be called, I scanned the crowd. Faces beamed with pride, cameras flashed, and applause echoed through the auditorium. But there was no one there for me. Not a single familiar face. My parents hadn't even sent a message. I felt a flicker of bitterness, but then it was replaced by a wave of something else, determination. When my name was called, I walked across that stage with my head held high. The cheers from the audience, though not for me, filled the space around me. I shook hands with the dean, accepted my diploma, and stepped off the stage with a quiet, satisfied smile. After the ceremony, as graduates posed for photos with their families, I slipped away. I walked alone down the quiet streets surrounding the university, the weight of the diploma in my hands. I ended up sitting on a park bench, staring at the sky painted in the warm golds and pinks of the setting sun. It was in that moment that I made a decision. I wasn't just going to move on with my life. I was going to succeed beyond what anyone, especially my parents, had ever imagined. I was going to make them regret every dismissive comment, every cruel word. I started applying for jobs, big jobs. Positions in competitive firms, roles that people said were out of reach for someone like me. But I had something they didn't know, a record of hard work, academic excellence, and a relentless drive that couldn't be measured by a family's opinion. When I landed a position at a prestigious consulting firm, with a starting salary that made my head spin, I couldn't help but smile. I moved into a sleek apartment in the city, bought myself a reliable car, and slowly but surely built a life that was entirely my own. But even then, I didn't call my parents. I didn't send them a letter or a message. I waited. I waited until the day when I knew they would have no choice but to see me, not as the failure they had always imagined, but as the man who had outsmarted them all. It was a few years into my new life, promotions, bonuses, and my name quietly rising in industry circles. I had become someone they would have boasted about if they had known, if they'd cared. But I kept it quiet, not out of fear, but strategy. I wanted my return to be undeniable. One evening, while skimming emails, I saw a message that made my breath catch. It wasn't from them, but from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned, almost casually, that my parents' home was in foreclosure. Bank notices were piling up. Rumors swirled of my father's failed investments, my mother's lavish spending habits catching up to them. I leaned back, fingers steepled under my chin, a slow, cold smile forming. So this was it. Their empire of arrogance, built on dismissing me, was crumbling. They were vulnerable, exposed. I didn't rush. I waited a few more months, let the storm batter them until the roof was practically caving in. Then, armed with quiet confidence and more than enough money, I reached out to the bank. A few strategic phone calls, some paperwork shuffled across desks, and suddenly the foreclosure stopped, because I bought the house. The day I walked up to that front door, I could see them through the window. My father slumped on the couch, my mother pacing. The air was thick with tension, the walls probably echoing with the fights they'd been having since the letters arrived. I knocked once sharply. My mother opened the door, her face pale, her eyes widening as she took me in. I was dressed in a tailored suit, calm and composed. For a moment, she seemed genuinely glad to see me, relief flickering across her face. "Charles! Oh, thank God, we've been trying to." I raised a hand, cutting her off. "I'm not here to help. I'm here to collect what's mine." Confusion twisted her features. "What are you talking about?" I pulled the deed from my coat pocket, unfolded it slowly, deliberately. "This house. It's mine now. Bought it outright. As of today, you're no longer the owners. You're tenants." My father stumbled into the hallway, his face flushed with anger. "You can't be serious. This is our home." I met his eyes without flinching. "No, Dad. It's my home now. You can either pay rent, under my terms, or pack your things and leave." Silence. For the first time in my life, they had nothing to say. My mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. My father's shoulders sagged as if the weight of all his failures had finally crushed him. The moment was everything I'd imagined and more. I stepped over the threshold, my footsteps echoing sharply on the tile. My parents shrank back as though my presence alone was a storm battering the fragile walls of their world. My mother's hand trembled against the doorframe, her lips quivering with words she couldn't quite form. "You can't do this," my father finally choked out. His voice was small, defeated. "We raised you. This is your family's home." I laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that reverberated through the hallway. "Raised me? Is that what you call it? You told me I was worthless. That I'd waste your money, remember? You said I wasn't smart enough for college. You made me feel like a burden in my own home. Now this house, the one you mocked me in, belittled me in, it belongs to me." The weight of my words hung heavy in the air. My mother tried again, her voice softer now, pleading. "But we're your parents. Can't we just work something out? Please, Charles." I held up the deed, its crisp edges catching the light. There's nothing to work out. You can stay under my terms. Rent will be market rate. Utilities split. And you will treat me with the respect I deserve. Or you can leave. But understand this, you will not manipulate me again. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. My father's face contorted with rage, but he said nothing. My mother sank onto the nearest chair, burying her face in her hands. I stood there, watching them crumble, feeling a surge of emotions that twisted inside me, satisfaction, bitterness, even a flicker of regret. But mostly, there was a cold, sharp clarity. I had won. I had taken back the power they tried so hard to strip from me. I turned toward the door. I'll have the lease agreement sent over tomorrow, I said quietly. Consider this a courtesy. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit my face, and I drew in a long, slow breath. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest had lifted. I wasn't the boy who had left in the dead of night, broken and humiliated. I was the man who had returned with power in his hands and no need for their approval. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time after I left the house, watching the windows where I used to sit as a child, staring out at the world I felt shut off from. Now, I was the one on the outside by choice. I had wrestled back my life from the shadows they tried to trap me in. As I walked to my car, I felt an unexpected stillness settle over me. I had always imagined this moment would be filled with triumphant shouts, a cinematic revenge scene that would leave them gasping. But now that it had happened, the feeling wasn't as simple as victory. Yes, I was satisfied. I had shown them, no, I had forced them, to see the man I had become. The boy they dismissed, underestimated, and discarded was gone. I had climbed higher than they ever dreamed possible. And now they were at my mercy. But as I sat in my car, staring at the steering wheel, I realized something deeper. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had spent so many years driven by a desire to prove them wrong, to make them see me. And I had succeeded. But standing in front of that house, watching their world collapse under the weight of my success, I saw them for what they truly were, fragile, petty, and ultimately powerless. I was free. I started the car and drove away, not looking back. My phone buzzed with a text from the lawyer, confirming the transfer of ownership was complete. I didn't bother to reply. Let them sit with the knowledge that everything they'd once controlled was now under my terms. I knew they would scramble to find a way out, to twist the narrative, and paint me as the villain. But I didn't care. The people whose approval I once craved had no power over me anymore. I had built a life of my own, carved from hard work, resilience, and a stubborn refusal to accept their version of my worth. As I merged onto the highway, the city lights spread out before me. I felt the weight of the past dissolve. This was my life now, on my terms, without the need for their acceptance. In the days that followed, the silence from my parents was almost deafening. No frantic calls, no desperate texts, just a hollow quiet that echoed louder than their scorn ever did. Part of me expected them to fight back, to claw at me with the same biting words they'd wielded when I was young. But they didn't. Instead, I received a single, sterile envelope in the mail. Inside was a copy of the lease agreement I'd had my lawyer draft. My father's signature was scrawled at the bottom, his handwriting shaky, almost reluctant. My mother's name appeared next to his, her elegant loops subdued into something smaller, more cautious. They had signed. The power shift was complete. It was a strange feeling, seeing those signatures. I traced the letters with my fingertips, feeling a cold sort of triumph seep into my bones. For years I had lived under their roof, listening to their snide remarks, their dismissive comments about my dreams. And now they lived under my roof, bound by my rules. I could have made it unbearable for them. Raised the rent to impossible levels, imposed strict conditions, turned the screws until they were forced to leave. But I didn't. Not because I felt mercy, but because I knew that simply existing under my shadow, answering to me, was punishment enough. In a quiet moment, I sat by the window of my apartment, the city sprawling out below me, lights glittering like distant stars, and reflected on everything that had brought me here. The endless shifts at the diner, the cold nights huddled over textbooks, the whispered doubts that haunted my every step. I had built myself from the ground up, brick by brick, scar by scar. I thought of the boy I used to be, the one who stood outside that house, listening to their laughter as they dismissed him. Would he recognize the man I had become? Would he believe that one day, he would be the one holding the deed to the house that had always felt like a cage? As I watched the sun dip behind the city skyline, I felt a deep, quiet peace settle over me. I wasn't driven by revenge anymore. I didn't need their approval, their apologies, or even their understanding. What I needed was this: the knowledge that I had done what they believed impossible. That I had risen above the limitations they tried to chain me to. I was finally free. When the lease payments started arriving in my account, I didn't even bother to open the statements. It wasn't about the money. It was about the shift in power, the reversal of roles, the silent acknowledgement that I had outgrown them in every way. That night, I lay in bed, the city's quiet hum filling the silence. I thought of all the moments they had tried to belittle me, crush my dreams, and reduce me to nothing. I realized, in a bittersweet way, that they had given me the greatest gift, because without their cruelty, I might never have found the fire to forge my own path. And in the end, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. In the end, standing at the threshold of my own hard-earned life, I realized something simple but profound. I didn't need their validation. I had longed for it, worked for it, bled for it. But now, watching them bend under the weight of my success, I felt a quiet clarity. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about liberation. If I could speak to that scared, determined boy I used to be, I'd tell him this: never let anyone's disbelief limit your dreams. Prove them wrong, not for them, but for yourself. And as I walked away from the house one last time, I didn't look back. I didn't need to.